Well, yes. For what it's worth, I've gone on for years about the importance of thinking about the long term.
The palace stood in shock as King Charles received news that could change the monarchy forever. His face turned pale as fear spread through his whole body. This was not a normal message or a rumor. It was something no monarch in modern history had ever been told. The royal family gathered in tension, unsure what would happen next. Across the nation, people waited, wondering what truth had just shaken the crown. What could be so powerful that even a king was not ready for it? Join us as we unravel a twist that no throne in centuries had ever encountered. The monarch's breaking moment. Buckingham Palace stood under a thick winter sky as dawn pushed through slow layers of pale light. The guards changed positions and moved around the front gates with steady action, unaware that history was about to expand into a new shape. Inside, the halls of the palace carried their usual rhythm. Footsteps moved across glossy floors, papers sat stacked on desks, and the air stayed controlled and formal. Then the sound of rushed movement began to break the palace order. Time seemed to push itself out of shape as tension began to spread through rooms that once felt heavy with order. The sealed letter arrived inside a dark envelope. It did not travel through normal channels. Instead, it moved through palace hands. Senior aides carried it close to their chest and pushed through double doors with a force that broke the morning calm. Their faces stayed pale and their voices carried no strength. The palace understood something heavy had arrived. No one tried to stop it, no one tried to slow it down. The envelope came from a place that held more power than ceremony. Its weight felt larger than the crown itself. The king sat alone in a private study, away from cameras and away from routine. The clock in the room ticked on the wall, but soon the sound faded under the pressure of the unknown. The envelope reached the desk and stopped there. For a moment, time did not move forward. The aides stepped back. The door closed behind them. The king reached out and pulled the envelope closer. He broke the seal and dragged the paper out. The words on the page pulled the air out of the room. His breath slowed and his fingers locked in place. The letter held information that could not be handled by tradition. The crown could not hide from it. Outside the study, palace staff stood in small groups and tried to slow their breath. They waited for news, but nothing came. They listened for footsteps, or an announcement, or anything that could carry meaning. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath. The history around them felt thin, as if the walls could fall. Something larger than one man now sat in the center of Buckingham Palace. The king stayed still in the chair for a long time. His eyes moved across the paper again and again. The letter forced him to step out of his place as monarch and step into a simple role as a human being. The crown had always carried rules. The news in the envelope broke these pieces apart and spread them in different directions. He placed the letter on the desk and stood up slowly. The world he controlled now felt too far away to hold. He walked toward the window and looked at the land that stretched beyond the palace walls. Everything he once knew now sat behind him, as if the world had built a second layer that covered the first. The palace remained unaware of the details, but it felt the change. A tension moved like a current through the building. Time seemed to stretch and twist into a shape no one could name. The king placed both hands on the window frame and tried to hold himself steady. The letter spoke of a force that could break a monarchy from inside. The message did not come from foreign threats or old enemies. It came from something within. He tried to push away fear, but fear pushed itself back into his bones. His shoulders began to fall, as if the crown sat on him with more weight than before. He turned from the window and moved back toward the desk. He picked up the letter and folded it slowly, as if slowing the act could slow the future. In another part of the palace, whispers moved through staff who tried to make sense of the change in energy. No one could see the letter, but everyone felt it. The building seemed to change temperature. It felt colder. It felt sharper. The palace could no longer pretend that day would stay ordinary. The king walked through a long corridor and felt the floor move beneath him. He passed portraits of ancestors and felt judged by eyes that once ruled lands with harsh strength. He moved into a room lit by golden lamps. He sat down again, but this time he did not sit like a king. He sat like a man who had been asked to step through a door he never wanted to open. The letter placed before him had changed his place in the world. It forced him to think of endings. It forced him to think of power that could slip through fingers. Slowly, he placed the letter in a drawer and pushed it shut. The act did not make the news disappear. It only hid it from sight. His breath now moved slowly. his heartbeat louder than the ticking clock. The room pressed inward as if it tried to swallow him. He stood again and walked toward the door. He knew he could not escape. The day did not ask for permission. It arrived and it broke tradition. It forced the king to stand in a place no monarch had stood before. The palace would never return to the world it held before dawn. The hidden buildup. In the days before the envelope reached Buckingham Palace, a silent pressure began to build inside the monarchy. The change did not arrive overnight. It grew slowly, like a movement beneath the ground. Life inside royal circles followed a strict pattern. Plans sat locked into calendars. Royal duties stretched across months. Yet beneath the order, events began to move and create cracks inside traditions. Senior figures inside the palace started to notice patterns that did not match old expectations. Weeks earlier, reports arrived from different parts of the nation. They described shifts in loyalty among groups that once followed royal influence without pause. Meetings began to fill with tension that never reached public ears. Advisors gathered and tried to rearrange schedules to protect the king's energy. His body carried age and duty, and those two forces began to mix in ways that could no longer remain unseen. His steps grew slower during long walks. His hand trembled after certain speeches. These signs passed, but the palace recorded each one. At the same time, internal files revealed new information about land, finances, and alliances tied to the institution. Numbers began to fall into places that triggered concern. The crown depended on pillars older than any living citizen. Now those pillars began to show thin lines along their surface. Experts inside royal departments tried to explore solutions. They tried to pull numbers apart and rebuild them into stability. Yet every attempt brought more weight, as if the institution had expanded beyond what could be carried by human structure alone. Countries tied to the monarchy through tradition began to change direction. Their leaders arranged private meetings without royal involvement. Their documents carried signatures that did not include the British crown. The palace learned of these shifts through private channels, and each message carved deeper marks inside the institution. The king received short summaries about these developments, but they did not hold the full story. Aides tried to protect him from the magnitude of change. Still, fragments reached him. Inside the royal family itself, movements grew more personal. Dynamics between key members changed. The palace created new rooms for confidential conversations. Tension moved through private walls like a cold breeze. People who once stood close to the king now stepped back. Others moved forward and tried to gain influence. The structure of power inside the family began to tilt. This quiet struggle did not break into open conflict, but it left a shadow across the palace. In the background, an unseen force began to rise. It did not belong to politics or economics. It did not belong to foreign governments. It belonged to something internal. It began in whispers among experts who monitored royal systems. It expanded, and soon it reached people who understood that the monarchy could face a moment where decisions might break instead of bend. They created reports to explain the situation, but those documents moved into folders that stayed sealed. Eventually, a single report formed that combined health, structure, alliances, and future. This report held every part of the silent pressure. It painted a picture that could not be ignored. It explained what might arrive if changes did not begin. It described a future that carried more threat than stability. People inside the palace stood around the document and stared at it. They understood it would reach the king. They did not know how he would carry it. As these elements rose together, the palace environment changed. The palace grounds outside looked calm, but inside, movement became restless. Staff watched leaders act with urgency. Guards sensed tension but did not understand its origin. The entire institution felt like it waited for something. Then came the decision. The report needed to reach the king. A seal was pressed onto the envelope. The wax hardened over royal markings. The report folded into pages. The envelope became a vessel that carried everything the palace feared. The messengers kept their steps steady while trying to hide the truth from their own minds. The palace stood tall and watched them move through its body. The decision had been made. That envelope held the trigger. It represented weeks of tension, months of shifts, and years of quiet decline in areas that once stood unshakable. It represented a turning point. Buckingham Palace had begun to transform long before it arrived, but when it reached the king, transformation changed into inevitability. The momentum of the message. Inside Buckingham Palace, the chain reaction gradually began. The moment word spread that something unusual had reached the king, energy changed across the building. The palace relied on structure, it relied on order. Yet nothing felt orderly after the envelope arrived. Staff members worked through duties with hands that tried not to shake. Their minds moved faster than their steps. The building seemed to absorb the tension and release it back into the people, as if it pushed them to feel every inch of change. Inside offices where administration took place, workers tried to continue their duties. Paper stacks sat ready for processing, but focus slipped. Eyes drifted, heads turned toward hallways. People felt something heavy move above them. Through floors where the king held the envelope, they sensed something had begun that might reshape their roles. The staff lived inside a hierarchy that rarely shifted. One envelope now pushed that hierarchy into motion. Security officers gathered in small locations across the palace. Radios sat on their belts, their boots pressed against floors with strong grip. They stood tall, but they also watched each other. Their orders did not change, yet their instincts changed. The palace rarely shifted without schedule. That day, movement came without warning. They studied corners and tried to map potential risks. They waited for signals from upper layers of command as time passed slowly around them. In private staff quarters, where uniforms hung and people stored personal items, low whispers moved through small spaces. Staff leaned against lockers. They sat on benches and stared into nothing. Thoughts turned into stories that never reached their tongues. No one wanted to break the atmosphere with words. Even thoughts felt heavy. The palace shaped their lives. They depended on stability. Now stability felt thin. They tried to push fear away, but fear returned. Elsewhere, senior officials gathered behind closed door. They placed folders onto a table and opened them. Their eyes moved across lines of data. Much of their focus stayed on how the information might shift the palace in the coming days. They tried to build ideas that could protect order. They attempted to draw maps of future decisions. They needed to remain calm, yet calm did not live in the room with them. Their discussions formed quiet waves that passed outward into corridors, even though no one heard them. Meanwhile, royal assistants responsible for communication looked at screens filled with drafts, announcements, and schedules. Their job was to manage image and timing. On normal days, these tasks followed predictable lines. That day, they sat frozen. Their fingers hovered above keyboards. Their minds tried to anticipate what the palace might soon face. They felt a responsibility that weighed heavier than they could carry. They did not know when they would be asked to step forward. They only knew they would. The palace itself acted like a container for emotion. It kept secrets, it held history. It watched as staff shifted through uncertainty. Staircases, once filled with coordinated footsteps, now felt like empty monuments. Their banisters reflected dim light, while silence pressed through the air. Rooms that normally welcomed guests remained closed. Curtains hung untouched. A stillness grew inside halls where kings and queens once walked. As the day progressed, exhaustion began to spread through the staff. Minds that worked endlessly to guess the future began to slow. Shoulders dropped, feet dragged. People tried to hold themselves together using routine. Every action felt heavier. Every second felt longer. Some leaned against walls and tried to steady their breath. Others continued walking to avoid sinking into fear. At one point, senior aides moved through the building again. Their presence caused heads to raise and backs to stiffen. Their suits moved with sharp edges. Their steps struck the floor with purpose. Staff tried to read their faces, but their expressions hid everything. Aides passed without pause, carrying files that did not show their contents. The staff watched them disappear behind another door. That door closed, leaving tension behind it like a shadow. Across the palace grounds, the outdoor staff noticed small changes too. The palace exterior looked strong, but the people who cared for it no longer felt steady. They looked toward the main building and sensed an invisible storm gathering inside the walls. By evening, staff members felt drained. They walked slower. Their eyes carried weight. They tried to sleep in private quarters, yet sleep did not arrive easily. They lay still and stared at ceilings. Some turned on small lamps and watched the light. The palace continued to hold its breath, and staff continued to wait for direction. The envelope had entered only one room. Its message had reached only one man, but its arrival spread through every space, every task, and every person. Buckingham Palace stood unchanged in form, yet completely altered in atmosphere. Staff held tension like a shared burden. No words captured what waited, and no movement could change what had begun. Buckingham Palace reacts in silence. The moment King Charles received the envelope, a ripple of reaction spread quietly through Buckingham Palace. The palace, normally a place of routine and predictability, suddenly felt like it was being measured by a new and invisible force. In one of the large administrative offices, officials pushed aside their work to form a small group. Schedules and plans, once clearly laid out, were now torn apart by uncertainty. Every decision seemed to hang in the air, waiting for confirmation from the king. Yet no matter what they tried, nothing could soften the impact of the message. The palace corridors, usually alive with controlled movement, felt different. Staff members who passed each other slowed down. They looked at doors and windows, noticing details they had overlooked for years. The portraits lining the walls seemed heavier. The chandeliers cast sharper reflections. Each step echoed in ways that made silence feel louder. People tried to push through tasks, but the weight of unseen urgency slowed every motion. Even routine gestures, like carrying papers or opening doors, became acts requiring focus. In the private chambers where senior aides waited for instructions, tension pressed against every surface. They pulled folders out of drawers, spread out reports, and tried to follow emergency protocols. They silently watched each other for signs of fear or hesitation. Each aide tried to measure the importance of moment. The palace demanded composure, but the moment demanded instinct. Staff adjusted positions repeatedly, walking back and forth to ensure nothing was missed. Each step added to the collective pressure pressing through the building. Security officers stationed throughout the palace reacted in subtle ways. Radios buzzed and they checked positions repeatedly. Their hands rested on belts and equipment as if expecting a command to step forward at any moment. Their eyes moved quickly along corridors. They tried to hold positions while staying alert for movement that might indicate risk. Every floor, every stairwell, and every doorway seemed to carry significance that had not existed before. They adjusted stances and shifted weight as though the palace itself demanded readiness. In staff offices hidden from public view, secretaries and clerks tried to continue typing, but each keystroke carried hesitation. Documents were scanned and scanned again. Messages were prepared but held back, waiting for instruction. The energy inside the room pressed down on every shoulder. Some staff leaned against walls, taking small breaths to steady themselves. Others paced lightly, attempting to channel the tension into physical motion. The palace felt alive with quiet energy, moving slowly, pressing on every surface like a tide that refused to recede. The king's personal aides moved quickly through halls to deliver messages and gather updates. They opened doors and closed them with controlled precision. They tried to maintain composure, but their bodies betrayed attention to small details. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every shadow seemed to demand observation. They carried folders and reports repeatedly, checking and double-checking that nothing had been missed. Each trip through the corridors left a trace of unease, spreading silently among those who observed. In waiting areas, advisors and aides moved chairs and rearranged desks. Papers were shuffled repeatedly. Plans were discussed, rearranged mentally, then put aside. They carried the knowledge that each decision could affect more than a schedule. The king's attention held the ultimate weight. Staff measured each action as if the palace demanded that no error could escape notice. The silence was not ordinary. It carried the weight of expectation and responsibility. By mid-afternoon, the ripple had spread to nearly every part of the palace. Staff across floors, wings, and basements moved with the rhythm of urgency. They repeated actions to ensure nothing was left out. Footsteps grew rhythmic but careful. Hands rested on counters and desks while minds raced through contingency plans. The building itself seemed to inhale and exhale along with the people inside. Buckingham Palace had always carried history, but on that day, it seemed to carry the future on its shoulders. By evening, the immediate reaction had shaped an unspoken but visible tension throughout the building. Staff members who had been moving quickly now moved with cautious precision. Advisors continued to rearrange reports and recalibrate plans. Security officers checked positions again. Maintenance crews moved slowly yet deliberately. The envelope had reached the king, but its effect had traveled further. It touched every room, every corridor, and every person who carried even a part of the palace's operation. Buckingham Palace had not broken. Its walls remained solid, its doors remained closed, its gates remained guarded. Yet inside, it had shifted. The moment had arrived, and every individual within had become part of the response. The king's decisions still waited in the private chambers. The palace carried its weight, preparing itself for the next movement, the next instruction, the next decision that would shape history. The crown and succession at risk. The moment the news reached the king, the implications for the crown stretched far beyond his private chambers. Buckingham Palace had long existed as both a home and a center of governance. Every decision, every ceremonial action, and every message had the potential to shape the monarchy's future. The envelope he had received did not just carry information, it carried consequences. Advisors understood that its contents could redefine the line of succession, the roles of heirs, and the stability of centuries-old traditions. Immediately, senior officials began mapping. They reviewed documents outlining succession protocols, titles, and responsibilities. Any change to the king's actions would inevitably alter the path for the next generation. Every document was cross-checked, every protocol revisited. The palace kept records of every precedent, yet the envelope held a new variable that none of those records could fully predict. The rules were written in law, but the situation demanded interpretation. Each option carried weight that stretched across decades. The king himself moved through the palace with a new awareness of what rested on his shoulders. Every step he took symbolized continuity. The line of succession was more than names on a list. It represented stability for the nation, trust from the public, and the reputation of the monarchy around the world. The envelope's news threatened to shift that balance. For the first time, the king had to consider possibilities that could alter the order of heirs and the responsibilities they would inherit. What had been steady for centuries now appeared fragile. The immediate concern revolved around the heir apparent. His role had been defined, rehearsed, and prepared over decades. Plans for public appearances, charitable work, and governance had been built around him. Suddenly, some of those plans required revision. The king's advisors worked to outline new scenarios. They examined contingencies, adjusting schedules, titles, and responsibilities. Every alteration was logged and rechecked, ensuring that the smallest decision did not cause unexpected complications elsewhere in the institution. Beyond the heir, other members of the royal family were also affected. Cousins, siblings, and distant relatives had responsibilities tied to tradition and ceremony. These roles were often symbolic, but they carried practical implications for how the monarchy functioned. With the news from the envelope, some duties would shift. Some titles might be reassigned or held in temporary suspension. Staff members who managed these responsibilities began to move and prepare for formal notices for eventual approval. The palace legal team entered discussions with a renewed sense of urgency. Laws governing succession were clear, but interpretation of unusual circumstances required careful handling. The team worked through historical examples, tracing back centuries to understand how unusual events had been addressed in the past. They examined decrees, letters, and archived correspondence. Every detail had to be considered, as a single misstep could create confusion both inside and outside the institution. The law provided guidance, but it could not account for the complexity of emotion, human error, or unforeseen reaction. Meanwhile, the king and his advisors assessed the broader impact on governance. Changes in succession affected not just ceremonial roles, but also political perception. The monarchy had to maintain authority and credibility while navigating the private challenges created by the news. Even small actions could be interpreted as weakness. The palace staff took care to align every decision with both tradition and public expectation. This required constant communication between departments, careful planning, and rehearsal of potential scenarios. One of the most delicate aspects involved public perception. While the palace worked, staff reviewed how changes in succession might be interpreted by the nation. They analyzed historical events when heirs had taken on greater responsibility unexpectedly, noting how public confidence had risen or fallen in response. Every precedent offered lessons. The team worked to ensure that the king's decisions reinforced trust in the institution while protecting the future of the crown. They rehearsed messages, prepared formal statements, and mapped possible reactions without ever releasing them publicly. At the center of all of this, the king remained measured but aware. He understood that the succession was not simply a list of names. It was a living chain of responsibility that connected generations. Each member of the family represented continuity, authority, and symbolic leadership. A single adjustment to the order or duties could spread outward, affecting the monarchy's stability. Royal advisors moved through rooms adjusting plans and preparing for immediate action if required. The king reviewed each scenario and considered how every choice would affect heirs, relatives, and staff alike. Even the ceremonial aspects of royal life were affected. State events, public duties, and formal appearances depended on a precise chain of authority. Any deviation in succession could create confusion over who should attend, who should speak, and who should represent the monarchy. Staff meticulously reviewed upcoming events, redrawing schedules, updating guest lists, and ensuring that protocol reflected the new realities introduced by the envelope. Every gesture, every title, and every interaction had to be recalculated. By the evening, Buckingham Palace had become a hive of quiet but intense preparation. Every department knew that decisions made in the next hours could redefine the monarchy for generations. The king, aware of this responsibility, moved through his private chambers with careful attention to both the letter and the spirit of the institution. The crown remained in place, but its future now balanced on choices that would unfold slowly, yet with undeniable weight. The palace remained outwardly unchanged, its doors were closed, but inside the machinery of power had shifted. The king, his advisors, and the staff understood that the line of succession and the stability of the crown depended entirely on the decisions made in that calm but decisive moment. Every step forward would carry consequences. Every action had to be measured, deliberate, and planned. Buckingham Palace had faced uncertainty before, but nothing carried the weight of change like this. Power shifts inside the palace. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, tension moved like a silent current. The king's private chambers became the center of attention, not only for advisors but for members of the royal family. The envelope had arrived, carrying news that demanded decisions beyond ceremony. In these rooms, power took a human shape. It pressed on shoulders, moved through steps, and shifted air as a shadow passing across walls. The king entered one of the smaller private drawing rooms, a space rarely used for formal matters but now filled with importance. The room was carefully arranged with chairs and tables, each placed with intention. Portraits of past monarchs hung on the walls. Their eyes seemed to watch as the king and his family prepared to process what had arrived. Every movement carried significance. Even a simple step across the carpet held weight. The atmosphere had thickened, pressing against the walls and into every person present. Senior family members gathered, moving to take their places. They did not speak at first. Each person carried a mixture of apprehension and instinct, weighing what the news meant for them personally and for the monarchy as a whole. They had trained for public appearances and ceremonies, but this moment required private judgment. Roles that once appeared fixed were now uncertain. Every action became part of a silent negotiation of power. Decisions could not be delayed, but no one wanted to act too quickly. Every option required consideration and foresight. Private spaces that usually served as retreats now became arenas for strategic thought. Members paced lightly, adjusting their stance as they considered implications. They leaned over desks, tracing lines on documents with fingers that sought clarity. They paused to breathe deeply, as if inhaling could strengthen resolve. Eyes met across the room, measuring reactions without asking questions. The room carried the weight of generations. Every gesture reflected awareness that actions here could alter history. The tension expanded beyond immediate family. Cousins, siblings, and more distant relatives took note of changes in influence. Titles and duties long assumed to be ceremonial now demanded reconsideration. Advisors briefed individuals on how responsibilities could change. Some roles would grow in importance, others would contract. Decisions made would set the framework for public appearances, charitable work, and governance. Each movement inside the chambers became a rehearsal for the broader consequences that awaited beyond the walls. Throughout the private chambers, careful observation became a skill. The family monitored the king's reactions, noting his posture, gestures, and pace. They watched each other for signs of understanding or hesitation. Allies formed through proximity and shared focus. Tension revealed who would step forward and who would step back. Every action carried a dual purpose, one for the immediate moment, one for the wider future of the monarchy. The family adapted, moved subtly, and tried to maintain composure under pressure. Documents and reports circulated, handled delicately. Advisors stepped in to clarify points, pointing without speaking. The family absorbed the details, integrating them into a mental map of potential scenarios. Each person visualized outcomes, anticipated challenges, and adjusted personal stances accordingly. The room felt both heavy and alive, charged with strategy, history, and unspoken understanding. Decisions did not yet leave the room, but they were already forming in thought. As time passed, discussions grew sharper in focus. The king's family worked through a list of possible decisions. They traced effects on titles, roles, and responsibilities. They visualized the implications for public appearances, succession, and international perception. Each person held their own sphere of concern while remaining aware of the collective weight pressing on the group. Decisions were not made by a single voice. They emerged through careful calibration of attention, awareness, and observation. By evening, the chambers were filled with an intensity. Papers had been reviewed, scenarios outlined, and possibilities considered. The family stood and walked slowly between chairs, leaning on tables to steady themselves. Every gesture carried meaning, every movement held significance. Advisors remained nearby, supporting decisions that had yet to be made. The room held history, expectation, and responsibility simultaneously. Every second reinforced that the palace was not just a building, it was a living institution shaped by those within. The king moved through the chambers with careful awareness. His steps were deliberate. His posture was alert. He understood that the family had absorbed the weight of the news alongside him. He understood that actions taken here would echo outward. Buckingham Palace, long a symbol of continuity, now became the site of private negotiation, silent strategy, and careful preparation. The royal family, behind closed doors, faced a moment of clarity and responsibility unlike any before. Now this decision carried the full measure of history. The unavoidable crossroad. The palace had become a storm of anticipation. Buckingham Palace, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of stability, now felt like it was holding its breath. Every corner carried the pressure of an unseen force. The king walked slowly through private passages, each step measured, each breath deliberate. He had held the envelope, read it, and placed it aside. Yet the contents had already reshaped the space around him. The weight of decision pressed against his chest, unyielding, impossible to ignore. The king entered a private chamber and paused beside a heavy wooden desk. Its surface reflected the dim light of the lamps above, polished yet solid. The envelope had been placed in a drawer earlier, but its presence lingered in the room. The decision before him extended beyond routine. It was not ceremonial. It carried the weight of the crown, the lineage of the monarchy, and the perception of the nation. Every choice he considered seemed to echo backward and forward, touching past rulers and shaping those yet to come. He moved around the desk, pacing slowly. Each step pressed more weight into the wooden floor. Each breath drew the tension deeper into the room. Advisors watched from corners, careful to maintain distance, careful not to disrupt his thought. Their presence was steady, yet invisible. They had been trained to respond, to plan, and to anticipate, but this moment required more than preparation. It required intuition, patience, and a deep understanding of history. The king's decision could not be rushed. Historical documents were spread across a side table. Each paper contained rules, precedents, and recorded interpretations of past crises. Legal experts had compiled examples spanning centuries, showing how previous monarchs had faced unusual circumstances. The king's eyes moved over these documents repeatedly. He traced the lines with his fingers, lifted papers, and replaced them. He stood, then leaned over the desk again. The room held an energy that refused to dissipate. Time seemed to slow, stretching the moment into eternity. Outside, the palace remained outwardly unchanged. The king paused at the window, looking toward the grounds. Trees swayed in the evening wind. The sky deepened to gray and then navy. Light from the city filtered through clouds, casting faint shadows on the stone facade. He considered the future of the crown and the line of succession. He considered the people who would inherit responsibilities, the advisors who depended on stability, and the public who would never see the careful deliberation. Every thought moved through layers of history and expectation. The king returned to the desk and began to organize papers, moving some to the side, stacking others, adjusting positions. He thought through consequences, immediate and long-term. Every detail, every nuance mattered. The line of succession, the monarchy's image, the preservation of authority, all depended on a combination of careful judgment and instinct. The envelope had delivered news, but the decision was his alone. It demanded focus, patience, and a readiness to carry responsibility without faltering. Minutes passed, stretching into hours. He lifted one folder, replaced it, then moved to another. His gaze shifted across portraits of previous monarchs, painted with authority and permanence. He traced the frames with his eyes, thinking of tradition, of ceremony, of the weight that each king and queen had carried before him. He understood that the present was connected to the past, and that any choice would leave its mark on the future. History had prepared him, yet the moment required something beyond any precedent. As time passed, the palace seemed to contract around the private chamber. Silence thickened in the atmosphere. Staff remained in positions that allowed observation but not interference. The king's steps became rhythmic and focused. Even breathing seemed synchronized with the flow of responsibility. The envelope rested in the drawer, yet its presence dominated the room. The king's decision would determine not only what remained in the drawer, but what would unfold across the monarchy, the family, and the institution as a whole. The final steps of consideration involved planning the next actions. The king mentally rehearsed announcements, ceremonial adjustments, and logistical decisions. Every scenario was mapped in detail, every possible outcome considered. The process required courage, clarity, and a sense of accountability that no single protocol could provide. He thought of the line of succession, the institution, and the public. Each layer added complexity, yet he moved through them, tracing the path of responsibility that stretched ahead. Finally, the king stood upright, hands resting lightly on the desk. He had reached a point where deliberation could no longer continue. The decision waited, heavy and immovable, yet ready to be carried. Buckingham Palace remained still outside, but inside, history had already shifted. The king's actions would define the day, the institution, and the future of the monarchy. The envelope had entered quietly, however, its effects had expanded through the palace, shaping it, the people, and the crown itself. Do you think the monarchy would be able to scale through such an unpredictable period and still retain its relevance? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.